Good morning, colleagues. Thank you for attending and a warm welcome back to the POCA SA Ponder virtual presentation series. We will commence with a short presentation lasting about 30 minutes, a question and answer session of 10 minutes, and conclude with a lucky prize draw for a Takealot voucher worth 1,000 Rand. You are welcome to field questions in the chat box during the presentation, which will be answered by our guest speaker at the end. Colleagues, please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be up on our POCA SA website for those who will not be able to join us now. This morning, our guest speaker will enlighten us on a trending and very interesting topic, the KZN floods, the causes, the business impacts, and what needs to be done. He will be engaging us on what caused the KZN floods and how they have impacted businesses, including production and manufacturing. Our guest speaker will elaborate from a climate resilience point of view on what is wrong, why KZN keeps having these floods, and what needs to be done by government and businesses to protect their communities and their businesses and to avoid a recurrence. Our guest speaker, Tjeerd Driessen, has a Master of Science degree in Hydrology and Quantitative Water Management from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and has 2 minors in Climate Change and Natural Resource Management. He has 12 years of project experience in flood modeling, flood risk assessment, and water management in the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia regions. This experience ranges from working in the Hurricane Protection Office in New Orleans and developing a flood early warning system in the Caribbean to water balance modeling of a large river systems in Nigeria and flood risk assessments in Myanmar and Thailand. He is an IPMA certified project manager with experience working for public and private clients and international financing institutes such as the World Bank. He managed multiple projects for multinationals such as Unilever, Coca-Cola, Heineken, and various oil and gas companies to assess their flood risk and propose measures to reduce their risk. For the last 4 years, he has been living in Johannesburg and currently has the role of leading market director at the consultancy and engineering firm Royal HaskoningDHV, where he is responsible for the climate resilience market in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you, Tjeerd, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will.
Excuse me, Tjeerd, just to interrupt there. I'm struggling to hear you.
Is this better? Yeah.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you so much.
Right. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us during this POCA SA Ponder session. As Ayabelela mentioned, I'll have a brief presentation on flood resilience for businesses in general, and also specifically look at the KZN floods that happened in April. So I'd like to look at the KZN floods, but also when it comes to impact, discuss what are the global impacts on businesses that we see happening in the world. Touch upon the local flood impacts that we saw in KZN, and then work out what can be done to protect businesses in the region, which is a general approach, but can also be adopted in KZN. And then I will work it out in 3 different segments. So flood risk assessments, we'll talk about measures to reduce the risk, and also briefly touch upon a regional flood strategy that could be of assistance. So we all know the images and the news articles, maybe also you've experienced it yourself, what happened in April in the KZN province and the devastating impact those floods had. So understanding floods has become more complex over the years. We see more developments in urban areas. We see urbanization, which means that more people are settling at the same locations. So the density is bigger. We have climate change. We have supply chains that are becoming more complex and might also have a global impact when they are hit by a flood. So that's the complex matter of flooding. Looking specifically at the KZN floods in April, I think there are several causes that we can attribute or can look at to attribute this flood. First of all, settlement in floodplains. You see that people are still settling within the floodlines that have been defined. So it seems that there's like an uncontrolled planning or uncontrolled settling of people in those floodplains, which are actually just dangerous areas to live in. Also, an important one is the fact that alien vegetation, but also waste, is actually clogging in drainage infrastructure. Right. So if we have that alien vegetation and waste not being removed, and it's actually littered or clogged or grown in our water system, it clogs our bridges and culverts, for example, and that will also mean that you will get higher water levels and higher or greater flood extents. So maintenance is an important aspect in that regard. Thirdly, I think we also cannot ignore the fact that urban developments over the last decade have increased quite a lot. So that means that urban developments almost automatically means you have more paved areas, which means that water is not being infiltrated into the ground, but it's actually, being the runoff is actually higher, it's quicker. So because it's all falling on concrete, so that peak runoff, that peak discharge of water is higher than we used to experience. Also, I think we need to look at the design of infrastructure. Is that correctly designed, and is it also future-proofed to cope with the extreme events that we are experiencing now, but also can experience in the future? And lastly, when we look at flood impacts and the fact that, well, I believe at least 440 people have lost their life, that also comes down to disaster risk management and early warnings. And so how can people evacuate on time to be out of harm's way? Another thing that is often mentioned is climate change. And I'm personally of the opinion, and also from a professional point of view, that I will say, okay, climate change cannot be attributed to this specific event. Climate change is namely a long-term trend, a long-term process, that one event that happens in April in KZN cannot directly be linked to climate change. What we can say is that climate change will cause these extreme events to happen more frequently, and that this rainfall will also be more intense. Right, so the event that we're having now might not be as extreme in the coming decade. Right, so this also means that we need to future-proof our infrastructure. And so the storm event that might now have a chance of occurring on average once every 100 years, in the future, statistically, that might maybe even happen once every 50 years. Right, so if we want to keep designing our infrastructure at a certain level, we also need to look at climate change impacts. But before going into impacts in KZN, I also like to touch upon the global impacts on businesses. In my work, I've been working on quite some projects for large industries and businesses. And in general, what you can see is that the impact of floods will become larger in the future. And that's due to climate change, sea level rise, population growth, and the more international and complex supply chains that are being impacted. And so also if you, Munich Re, which is one of the larger reinsurers in the world, they also every year report on the economic losses, and they also see that there's a clear upward trend in the economic losses that the industry is experiencing. And also WMO, for example, so the World Meteorological Organization, also mentions that, for example, in the last 40 years, about 86% of economic losses are due to natural hazard events. So it's quite an important hazard to consider. And why is it important to consider for a business specifically? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, of course, external safety, right? So there should be a certain safety within the business. If you talk about heavy industry, there might also, for example, be explosion risks if sites get flooded, or other chemical explosions, for example, that might occur. So external safety is something that is of utmost importance. Another one which is critical is business continuity. If businesses cannot operate, they actually lose money for every day that they cannot operate. Another one is the economic stability of a region. For example, I'm from the Netherlands, and you have the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, which is responsible for 8% of the GDP. So you can imagine if that port will experiences flooding, that it has a national GDP impact. And I think that's also what you've now seen in KZN, that there's an impact on GDP due to these events. Also for a business, it might be important to consider what is the impact on their market position or market share. Are they losing market share because they are flooded relative to their competitors? Another thing is branding. If a site is being flooded for every year, then that of course is also not a positive thing for the brand of that specific business. Lastly, I think an important consideration is the fact that prevention of flooding is much cheaper than recovering from a flood. And recovering from a flood, you can do it a couple times, but at some point you, as a business, you might also get in trouble with your insurance company, because they will tell you, well, we can't recover every year. You also have to work on prevention. The cascading impacts of floods when they hit a certain business, that's also an important thing to note, especially because we have more international complex supply chains. In my career now, experienced quite some examples of very interesting cascading impacts that occur in the market. The most famous one might be the impact of the Thailand flood in 2011, where a lot of the Thailand economic estates were actually flooded, and the global production centers for hard drives, for external hard drives for a computer, were manufactured over there. The impact on the global price of hard drives, which you can see in the figure on the top right, was huge, and that was a global impact due to one flood event in Thailand. Also, for example, I came across a chip factory that was supplying chips for your car keys, right? And they supplied these chips to 70% of the car manufacturers in the world. So that particular factory did not flood in the end, so that's a good thing. But if they would have flooded, then that would have impacted 70% of all global car sales. Another one is an olive oil factory, for example, that had one production site. It's a huge brand, but they were actually in a very, very flood-prone area, and at the same time providing all products for the global market, right? So if that factory really did flood, and they did for a couple of times, you have a picture on the right, on the lower right, where you can see the flood levels in the factory that they experienced over the last decades. That will have global impact on actually the existence of that business. Another example is a fast-moving consumer goods company that was actually flooded, and after 9 months it was still not back in business, right? So the business interruption is huge at that point, and might also lead to actually, well, maybe not becoming bankrupt, but that site is not going to be recovered. In this specific event, I also know that the competitor, which was upstream and did not flood, actually gained 25% of the market share because they did not flood, and they had to take over the production of their competitor that did flood because they couldn't deliver to the market. So these are huge impacts for businesses. Other things that you could think of is, for example, a high-tech company. They maybe not have that many sites, but you can imagine that if they have hundreds of suppliers that are supplying to this high-tech company, and something goes wrong with their suppliers, and they cannot manufacture and process, then the impact, although maybe it's one small or two small suppliers that are impacted by a flood, it might also result into bigger impacts later on in the supply chain. Last example that I came across was, for example, a company that was providing nitrogen to 90% of companies in a port. And that company was at the same time located at one of the lowest spots in that port. So they, for example, had a near miss. They almost got flooded, and they almost were near a shutdown. Well, you can imagine if that would really have happened, the impact on 90% of the companies in a port is also huge. So these are just examples that I came across to just give you an idea of what kind of cascading impacts you could think of. And maybe you also know other impacts yourself. And that also shows the sense of urgency why companies want to look at flood protection or flood risk reduction. So back to KZN, the impacts on businesses. What I found is that the total repair cost is estimated to be about 70 billion rand, of which about, at least 5.5 billion is needed for the roads and almost 3 billion is needed for the rail infrastructure. The insurance claims, at least of two major insurance companies in South Africa, already exceed 5 billion, but most likely will be far higher. And then it's also important to note that the damages to, those houses, cars, personal belongings, that's just the starting point, right? Because the infrastructural damage also has a knock-on effect on economic activity. So the true indicators will, in the long run, be the GDP of a certain area and also the employment rate in an area to really understand the true cost of a disaster. So for industries in KZN, and especially, for example, the prospecting area, you could hear and also see that stock, for example, on site was damaged. Also, the raw material or the resources that is needed at the starting point of the manufacturing process were damaged. So those are all losses they have to take, and that's also impacting their supply chain because they cannot continue the process if they don't have the resources. Damage to assets. So assets can be buildings, can be vehicles, etc. But also the production process. So your production lines are actually impacted and need to be replaced or repaired before you can resume production. And that business interruption can be about a couple of weeks. I also mentioned in some cases it can even be months. For a business that has knock-on effects on the market share that they have in the local market, of course, financially, it will also have a knock-on effect, especially if the insurance company cannot recover for the costs that they're making, branding impacts, and of course, you will for sure get conversations with your insurance company on how to deal with this. But what can be done to protect businesses? In general, I would say there are 5 steps normally that we would propose when it comes to creating a flood resilience strategy. And those 5 steps are listed in those icons below. So first of all, we want to look at flood hazard. So you want to look at flood modeling, or at least getting an understanding of what kind of water levels, flood levels you may experience. And then it's not only important to look at the flood that happened, so not only look at the April flood in KZN, for example, but also look at what are other statistical possible flood events. If you then have an idea on what the flood hazard is, you can also look at what is the damage, so what is the impact of if such a flood would occur, right? So you can actually quantify in rands what would be the damage if such an event would occur. Thirdly, we would then combine that information. So if we have an idea on the different probabilities that an event can occur and the damages that occur when that event happens, we can also say what is the flood risk. And flood risk, if you look at from a quantitative point of view, actually means what is the annual cost of that flood risk. So meaning if you would put that money aside every year, you would be able to recover from any flood that might happen on average. So it's actually a cost item on your budget. It's theoretical, so most companies will not make that reservation, but that's how you should perceive it. So it's actually an annual cost that you're having. So if you're reducing your risk, It also means that you would have a saving because you have to allocate less money on your budget. If you have an idea on your flood risk, then you can start looking at, okay, if that flood risk is too high, what can I do to deal with this? What are the flood risk reduction measures that I can take to reduce that risk? Well, that flood risk reduction can then be compared to the investment cost of that measure, and then you can get a business case, like a cost-benefit analysis, if that investment is really worthwhile in the long run. And so from there on, if you then have cost-effective measures, you can come up with a strategy to implement it, right? And then you can formulate your flood resilience strategy. For businesses, we mostly simplify it to say, okay, you need to look at awareness, prevention, and response, right? So awareness means those first three bullets. So hazard, damage, and risk, understanding what is the risk on your side. And prevention and response refers to the type of measures you can take on site. And then actually, you also want to have a justification of your investments, of taking measures. So let's dive a little bit deeper in that flood risk assessment, those first three bullets. And so flood risk is actually a combination of hazard. So the hazard is the flood event itself. Where will the water be? The exposure is the second component. Exposure means what is present. Do we have all grasslands, or do we have a factory with high value manufacturing items? And also the vulnerability. Vulnerability means how vulnerable is a certain exposed assets to the flood. So you can imagine the vulnerability of a brick house would be less than if you would have a shack, for example, right? So they're both houses, but the vulnerability is different. So what we then do, so that's more the starting point of what flood risk is. What we then normally would do is look at hazard assessments. So as I said, we would do flood modeling. So I give you an example of a snapshot on the top right, and also look at the damage assessments and the damages that would occur if those flood events happened. And not only looking at direct damages, but especially for industry, it's important to also estimate the indirect damages. So what will be the business interruption? Because that, especially for businesses, indirect damage, so that business interruption part and the knock-on effects, in most cases that I've seen it, are much greater than the direct impacts on assets locally. So let me first show you a visualization of a flood model that we created, and also where you can see the damage visualized. So this is a 3D model of an area. You see the elevation of this area, and the river in the center. And in a moment, you'll see that you actually see a 100-year flood happening in blue. And at the same time, in yellow and orange, you will see where are assets, exposed items, and what is the damage for those areas. Right? So this helps us to identify, and this is from a regional point of view, so this is not specifically for a business, but also for a region, you can look at, okay, what is our flood events, what is the flood hazard, and at the same time, what is the damage that occurs in certain areas. And this helps you to formulate, okay, where do I need to focus when it comes to measures. So as I mentioned, we then quantify the economic risk, quantifying it actually in rands per year that you need to put aside. As I said, once you take measures, you want to do the exercise again to see, okay, what is the new risk that I would have if I would implement those measures? And the difference between the current risk is your risk reduction. And in the end, what you want to do in your cost-benefit analysis is comparing your investment cost to build those measures, which is a once-off cost, compare it with the risk reduction. So the reduced risk is actually a benefit. It's a long-term benefit that will be a saving for the lifetime of your measures. So talking about measures, it's important to note that there are different types of measures that you can take. And so there are three, in essence, you have three different types of measures. You have preventative structural measures, you have adaptive and non-structural measures, and you have emergency response measures. Right, so preventative structural measures can include like floodproofing of buildings, flood barriers, movable barriers that you can, for example, use for your entrance gates, right? That you want to have those entrance gates open as long as possible, but once the water is really there, then you want to close it for a short time, and also open it quickly. But also upgrading your drainage system locally, because you can, for example, on a site-specific case, you might want to protect your site specifically, but at the same time you also have stormwater on site, so you still want to drain that water, so you need to think about that as well. Adaptive and non-structural measures can include, for example, site selection. Site selection is actually the easiest one. So before settling somewhere, where is that site really the right location? So I would also advise to companies, if you settle somewhere, first do a flood risk assessment. First understand what are your risks and is it really the best place to settle? And if you look at the Prospecton area, just purely from a topographic point of view, I would say that location is one of the worst places to settle because it's also one of the lowest spots in the area. That will help you also in terms of master planning. So for master planning on sites could mean, okay, where are we going to put our assets? So maybe your substation, you don't want to put it on the lowest part of your site, right? But maybe in the highest area of the site, because that's critical infrastructure. And you can play around with that on site-specific cases, but also on regional cases. Also, non-structural measures can be early warning systems to warn staff for a flood that is approaching, but also policies that you want to institute. Emergency response measures are actually measures that you can take after or just before a flood happening. And for businesses, emergency response measures are all captured within a flood emergency response plan. And from my experience, that such a plan is mostly missing. So there's often a business continuity plan, but there's no specific a chapter or a specific plan when it comes to flood emergency response. And that's often something that I would advise companies to look at. So in the picture below, you see, for example, elevating your assets. That's on the lower left. Floodproofing your building is something that is shown there as well. A structural measure like a dike or a movable barrier like the aqua fence barrier in the center. And on the right, you can see a concrete flood wall, for example, that we designed in Thailand. Or a flood early warning system on your right that actually warns you of approaching danger. Lastly, we've been talking about businesses and how you can protect your sites, right? But in some instances, you also want to look at in a broader view, because in some instances, especially when there are multiple firms, multiple businesses affected, you might want to consider or explore if it's not more cost effective to have a collaborative approach, right, with other affected firms in the region, and also maybe to also involve your local municipality, so Itaquini in this case for KZN. That regional approach might in the end be cost effective, but this is something that can be worked out. And most likely for KZN, I guess a regional approach would be more cost effective than just protecting site by site. At the same time, it's also a more complex way because all stakeholders need to be on board and you need to have a collaboration with other parties. So it's also a more complex matter. Excuse me. So for a regional flood strategy, you want to actually develop an integrated flood management strategy. And that is required, I think, personally, to spend that 1 billion that is committed for KZN in a wise manner. And this flood management strategy could include, of course, fact finding. So what really happened in KZN, what was actually the damage to assets, but also to communities, and also try to identify the knock-on effects to get a real understanding of what is the real damage that this flood has. then work out a comprehensive quantitative flood risk assessment to really understand what is your economic flood risk, because this will help you also in the end to have a business case to say, yes, we need to invest because the risk is just too high. And what I would suggest is not just look at economic flood risk, but also at social flood risk. So that will actually include the social welfare impacts of not only businesses, but also of communities. So it actually looks, okay, what is the social impact of a flood? And that, I think, is an important thing to get an equal and inclusive conclusion on where flood risks are higher and where investments should take place. Thirdly, of course, that identification of flood risk reduction measures. As I mentioned, they should be structural, but also non-structural. It should be a combination. And at the same time, it should not only be, well, we call it gray infrastructure, meaning just concrete like bridges, culverts, concrete channels, etc. We also need to start looking at more nature-based solutions where we include natural aspects but also water aspects. So those are the blue measures to also allow more natural elements in our urban environments that can help us to reduce the flood risk. So, for example, if we would introduce that, it would give us a less paved area. So it would, for example, create less or lower flood peaks. Well, there's a whole new presentation I could give on this topic, but I hope you get the essence that adding more natural elements will help you in the long run. Lastly, knowing your flood risk, knowing what kind of measures you want to take, then eventually you want to build an adaptation strategy, to help you implement that flood management strategy. And then particularly, I think it's useful to also use methods that support decision making under the deep uncertainties that we're facing. Climate change is uncertain. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. So we might also be cautious to invest all at once, right? But maybe already start with no regret measures, and then when time goes by, start investing or implementing certain measures. So there are methods like the dynamic adaptive policy pathways that help us drafting an implementation plan, dealing with the uncertainties that are at stake. So in conclusion, flood impacts on businesses, yes, they are going to increase. That's the global trend, and I think in South Africa we can also say we locally see that flood impacts are increasing, but there are also ways to protect businesses. And well, my closing is often, what I think a company needs in the end is you want to have a thorough flood risk assessment to know what is your flood risk. If it's too high, you want to come up with a set of solutions that fit your property, your site, and in the end also get a sound justification of that investment, right? So that also helps you to explain also to higher management why you need to invest in certain measures, and especially that quantitative analysis of cost-benefit analysis, especially when we work with private sector clients, that is often appreciated because they have a clear business, like a storyline to go to the higher management and say, okay, we need this because it's actually a wise decision to do. The picture I showed on the right is a picture in New Orleans when there was actually a flood coming. It was communicated a couple of weeks in advance. It's like a large spillway. This house owner, assessed the risks, right? So he said, well, that risk is too high for me. I need to take action. So he checked the first box. Then he started thinking about customized solutions. Well, in this case, he got a contractor and started asking him to create a dike around his house. So that's quite customized, I would say. And in the end, he also made it. So the flood happened. I think the dike is about 3 meters high. The dike didn't collapse, and you could say that it's quite a sound justification of the investment. So this picture actually captures all 3 points quite nicely, I would say, but then on a homeowner perspective. That's my story for now. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tjeerd, for your presentation. So colleagues, we will now commence with the question and answer session. I'll be fielding the questions from the chat box to our guest speaker to answer. The first question is, do you know what the progress on recovery of the Durban port is, and what does government have to do to speed up this process?
Answer is no, I don't know. No, I was in Durban 2 weeks ago, and also tried to meet with government to understand what's going on. But I also understand that they are very busy now, actually all municipalities and province to work on damage assessments. So I'm not I don't know exactly what's happening in the port right now.
Okay, the next question is, what are practical things SCM businesses based in KZN have to do to protect their businesses? Do they have to relocate, or what it is that they have to do?
Well, relocation is could be one of the options, but it's also a very extreme, like last resort kind of option, right? So, well, as I actually suggested in my last slide, I think what every business should do is assess the risk, right? Assess the risk that they have on for their specific business, and you can quantify it in a way that I explained it, or you can very simply look at, okay, what kind of flood maps are available. You could look in more detail so there are different levels of detail in how you can look at that flood risk, and based on that flood risk decide, is it worthwhile for me to invest in measures, right? And those measures can be local measures, but that's in some places, especially when for small businesses, then that cost benefit analysis is not really worthwhile, or it's not showing you a positive cost benefit analysis, and that requires businesses then also make a stance to local government or provincial government that there's something they need, right? Especially for small business, they don't have those finances and those impacts to have a positive cost benefit ratio. So in that sense, I guess it's communicating with your municipality to see how you can resolve that issue if that flood risk is too high.
The next question is, what is the advice to small businesses who do not have the resources for professional flood assistance?
I think I just addressed that question, isn't it? Yeah. Kind of.
Okay. So another question in our chat box is, what exclusion should I look for in flood insurance?
What exclusion? That's an insurance specific question, but I do know that for insurance in insurance contracts, there are clauses, for example, that say that companies cannot be covered or reimbursed or insured when they are in areas that are, for example, flood prone, meaning, for example, they are within the 100-year flood line, or in some cases, I know FM Global, for example, which is a large insurance company for industry, they are well, they don't want their clients to be in 500-year flood lines, right? So to know where your location is, that's important, because there might be an exclusion in that sense. Also, there might be exclusions when, for example, a flood happened and in 2 years' time it happens again. Then the insurance company might come back to you and say, well, it's not an extreme event, it already happened 2 years ago, so you should have done something about it, right? So that portion is also important to note and to discuss with your insurance company.
The next question is, are businesses going to be given opportunities to assist in civil works to curb the disaster management? If so, it's businesses around which areas?
Yeah, I hope. I think private sector firms need to be involved in the recovery, right? So it's either in the emergency response now to just make sure that infrastructure is back in place, but also for the infrastructural projects that are needed to solve this problem in KZN. Yes, we need the private sector a lot, I think. I'm not in the position to comment on that. I think in the end that's also a governmental decision. But I think it will need a collaborative approach where private sector and public sector works together in the recovery.
All right. The last question here says, what can we do for the environment to alleviate the chances of more floods?
What can we do for the environment?
Yes. What can we do for the environment to alleviate the chances of more floods?
I'm trying to understand that question, because the environment itself is, of course, impacted by, well, in some cases, the waste, for example, that is coming down the areas. I think environmentally, your floodplain rehabilitations and ensuring that your floodplains are properly in place, managed, maintained, and that there's policy in place to ensure that those floodplains, also have their environmental value. That's an important thing. So waste management, for example, is important. Policies to regulate your floodplains are important, and that's more to alleviate your environmental impacts from a flood. But also, for example, water and sanitation, right? Water and sanitation impacts are also huge. If you see, I think the E. coli impact in the ocean due to a flood, because there's so much sewage also coming down. That's also quite an environmental impact that we need to address, how our sewage systems are designed to cope with these kind of events. Going back to those are impacts on environment, but that, as I suggested in my presentation, I think we should actually involve the environment in the solutions. So I would actually say, okay, let's create more environment or like ecological spaces in our urban areas that will actually use that water, use that water, store it, retain it. That can mean parks, that can mean stormwater harvesting, infiltration basins, etc., to store that water and ensure that not everything is discharged at once. There's great ecological value in that, and as I said, that's a whole separate presentation, but I think it goes both ways. It's about involving it in the measures, as well as trying to reduce the impact downstream.
Okay, thank you so much. A question we have here is, to what extent do you think adoption of greener methods of operating by businesses can help alleviate these natural disasters?
I think surely it can. It cannot prevent everything. So, for example, I think an important part was, for example, the water coming down from the Mlazi River, from Wageningen Dam. That's just a large amount of water that you cannot deal with on a site-specific basis. But, for example, for the smaller, like local rainfall storm events or flood events, definitely, I think if we add more of those nature-based solutions already on site level and ensure that the amount of water that is being discharged to your local stormwater drainage network is being reduced, because you retain more water on site, that will alleviate the pressure on the drainage system, and eventually will also lead to less flood, smaller flood extents, or less flood impacts.
All right, I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I will conclude the question and answer session. So thank you so much, colleagues, for a very engaging question and answer session. We will now proceed with the lucky prize draw, where one of you will walk away with a 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher. So I have the names of the attendees in here. And the winner is Ohopoleng Hope, the administrator at Clean Tech Investment. Congratulations, Ms. Hope. A Take-A-Lot voucher will be on its way to you soon. Colleagues, just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on our POCO SA website. You will also receive an email to remind you that the webinar has been uploaded on our website. And also, I wanted to mention that we have our annual conference coming up soon on the 24th to the 26th of August at the Sandton Convention Center. We will leave details of our website. It's www.goconnect2022.co.za. So you can go there and check out our website to read more about our annual conference that is coming up in August. So in conclusion, I would like to thank Tjeerd for sharing his knowledge and insights and educating us more on the KZN floods. Thank you very much, colleagues, for attending, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.